David, today marks 19 years since one of the most horrifying and tragic events, in modern history, of course. How are you feeling today, David?
I'm feeling well. It's good to be with you, Jason, on this extraordinary day, 19 years after not what I would call a tragic event. I would call it a criminal event
But
because,
also, the outcome was
well,
tragic.
it's obviously tragic, etc., and I'm not contradicting that. But the point is, I think if we use the word tragedy too often, it looks like it's some kind of accident about which no one could do anything. And this was a fundamental criminal infiltration of the United States command and control systems by people that I believe we can show today were based out of British Columbia after a conference of 1981. But we can explore step by step, but it's an extraordinary link because while people are looking at Osama bin Laden or theoretically in a cave in Afghanistan, there are people in British Columbia who have been planning this for 20 years. Over to you.
Yeah, I agree, David. It's going to be a really powerful show today for people to see. You and I have spent a lot of time developing today's show, and we're back in some regards, David, to our kind of more traditional method of creating these photo collages that sort of guide the story of what we're going to be talking about today. I think we should spend a little bit of time explaining what we've got here. I do want to let everybody know that we're going to have our sponsor exclusive segment starting in just 1 hour on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI, or Patreon and Subscribestar/crowdsource the truth. And David, what we've tried to illustrate in today's photo collage is this concept that artificial reality messages create not only fake news, but once everybody believes the fake news, it gets sort of etched in stone, as it were, as fake history.
Absolutely. And the key to that, of course, is to control the outcome of the crime scene investigation and what people investigate and what they don't investigate.
Yeah.
And it's very obvious, right, that these attacks were beyond the capability and the resources of the individual to which they've been attributed and would require military access to military assets, brilliantly coordinated, if that's the right word, that allow you to execute attack and then lay down what we're recently calling an artificial reality messaging facility, or it could be called an artificial intelligence narrative. There's a variety of terms, or just fake news. But at the end of the day, you plant in the minds of the public an image of what didn't happen such that they believe it did happen, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this extraordinary connection of the technology developed in World War II that is consistently used and manipulated by the same players right through to the 9/11 attack, of which this is the 19th anniversary. Over to you.
Yeah, and you and I have had a little back and forth about this concept of artificial intelligence narratives versus artificial reality narratives. I feel like it's an artificial reality narrative that we are now seeing how artificial intelligence is being used to help construct these artificial reality narratives. And I know that's very confusing. So let's get back for a moment, David, to the image, if we can, and explain to people what we've got here, because you've spoken to us about this Aspididra radio tower, which was critical and very strategic in World War II. The aspect that I didn't understand until yesterday is that what you've been describing to us is that, in Germany, they were having radio broadcasts, news, music, stories, whatever they had on the radio in the 1940s. And the British in England built a hugely powerful radio tower that was so strong when they tuned it to the same frequency as these German radio stations, they could broadcast to German civilians' radios. And when they made those broadcasts in German language, sending artificial reality messages to the people of Germany, they were able to fool them and cause them to think that these deceptive messages were in fact true. And the way the British initiated this opportunity was to fly British bombers over Germany which prompted the German radio stations to turn off transmissions from their own radio towers so that the bombers could not hone in on targets based on these radio transmissions. And this act of flying the British bombers over initiated the opportunity to take over the German radio network. Is that correct?
Absolutely, very well explained, and totally common to what happened on 911, right?
But before we get to 911, we got to fill in the blanks in there.
Okay. So let me
we
just
also
run
have
back
this thing
to
in the
history.
middle.
Yeah, let's run back to a little bit of history. So RCA, Radio Corporation of America in the United States, had two 250 kilowatt transmitters that the FCC, what's that, the Federal Communications Committee, would not allow them to sell in commission inside the United States, whatever reason I don't know, because they were considered too powerful. So the British Broadcasting Corporation sent some of their engineers over to the United States to buy these two transmitters, which were 2 times 250 kilowatt or 500 kilowatts. So they were brought over to the United Kingdom, clipped together, and the BBC engineers revved them up a bit to get 1 megawatt of transmission power for this medium wave transmitter. So it became the most powerful in the world. And then there was an added twist, if you will, because they made the frequency agile. So just as the Germans switched off their domestic radio transmissions to the public, the British Broadcasting Corporation with RCA would switch in at that same frequency and broadcast perfect German speakers with up-to-date news of where the bombs had been landing. So actually, through the fake broadcasts, or the artificial reality messaging, if you will, coming from the British, the Germans got a better idea of where the bombs were being placed. That was accurate, but didn't recognize that what was being transmitted to them about the plans of the Nazis, let's say, to evacuate their elites from the areas of Berlin that were being attacked, leaving the peasants or the proletariat to be fried. So there was a lot of disenchantment with the Nazi elite, as I understand it, amongst the German population because they thought they were being betrayed. Well, of course they were, but the betrayal was actually a concept being placed in their brains by the BBC.
Right. And it's explained here as black propaganda. It's a form of propaganda intended to create the impression that it was created by those it is supposed to discredit. Black propaganda contrasts with gray propaganda, which does not identify its source, and white propaganda, which does not disguise its origins at all. So basically, black propaganda, David, is fake news.
Well, absolutely. And the technology, because I guess I apply the term, the DNA of the technology is fascinating, because the technology in the UK around the 1940 or 1941 period, which allowed Americans and British to coordinate and synchronize their black propaganda, was known as the Combined Communications Electronics Board, right? Built by RCA. Now, if you flip back to the image, the opening image, and I'll just plant a clue that on the 47th floor of the North Tower, there was an offshoot of RCA, which is now called Circo. But no,
we don't want to jump the timeline here. We want to try to take people, David, from World War II through the advent of television and satellite broadcasts on television and real-time transmissions of what might have gone on in Dallas and up through today. So what do we want to say about this bit in the middle here?
Okay, so then fast forward to 1963, the year of the assassination of JFK, and just to help the audience put me into the picture, I was playing bridge at Cambridge when someone stuck their head around a corner, and you were staying in the same college in January, which is a fascinating little side trip, and they said, they've shot Kennedy, right? Now, I don't know, I can't remember who stuck their head around. I knew him as a friend of mine, but I forget his name. And that somehow the hairs on the back of my neck went up, right? The following year, I was out in Dallas on a holiday or vacation from university, pacing out the sight lines in Dealey Plaza to see if I could understand, as a mechanical engineer, what the hell happened. By sheer coincidence, I get my hair cut by Jack Ruby's barber, the guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And there's a picture of him shooting, a live picture on the television, which is quite interesting. Anyway, so I asked this guy, so what do the people of Dallas think about the assassination of JFK? And the hairs on the back of my neck still go up. And he said, everyone knows there were multiple snipers, right? Now, is that proof? No, of course it isn't. But isn't that an interesting comment from the barber of the guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald, who was therefore unable to determine whether he was a patsy, and I think that's what he was, or he was part of a wider network which was sending artificial reality messages both before, during, and after the assassination of JFK. And anyway, you have picked out particular scenes from the television of the time relating to announcements of the JFK assassination, which I think you've pictured on that television there.
Yeah, this is a scene outside Parkland Hospital. But David, we've also placed a symbolic image of the Telstar satellite right on top of this television. And, you know, my intention was to indicate that obviously in 1944, or, you know, well, earlier than that, in the 1940s, when the British were bombing Germany and dealing with this Aspididra radio tower, the average person had virtually no technology. I mean, you had electric lights and electric appliances and things like that, but people didn't have computers and televisions and even necessarily pocket radios in 1944 or 1940. And then by the time we get to 1963, most people had televisions, radios, electric devices. People had access to more technology, but it was only a scant few, like Abraham Zapruder, who even had a camera, and that involved film that had to be processed. He didn't have the type of real-time access that a satellite broadcast would give you, that certain Emmy Award-winning journalists might have been utilizing. Do we know for a fact that this Telstar satellite was used to broadcast TV images of the JFK assassination?
No, we don't, but it could, let's say. It was launched in 1962, and it already transmitted messages and live messages, I believe, with the JFK speech. So they alleged this was a Telstar which hooked actually the United States through to the BBC. So the BBC could show or transmit television pictures of, for example, fighters, you know, pugilists in the ring, and I believe elements of a speech from JFK. So the technology was available to provide, and this is essential for black propaganda, I believe, real-time transmission of the message that you want the audience to believe in, right? So it's absolutely key to get your message in, whether you call it fake news or artificial reality messages, before anyone has the time to investigate the crime scene to determine that you're lying.
Right.
That's the essence of black propaganda. And
Yeah,
the British understand that probably better than any nation in the world.
Get the message out there first, keep repeating it. Anybody who shows up with a counter message gets slammed as a conspiracy theorist or just ignored or whatever. And David, you know, you've told us many times about how critical timing has been one of the elements that's allowed the British Empire to flourish beyond any in the history of man. Your website, Reverse CSI Scripts, even has these two clocks represented on it, as well as the all-red line, the first mass communication technology that allowed the British Empire to be built.
And with the substitution of fiber optics, allows the British Empire to continue more powerful than ever and unrecognized, I believe. And just very quickly, those two clocks, the one at the top is outside the Greenwich Maritime Museum, and that, I believe, was patented around 1846 or something like that, around the time that the first cross-Atlantic or transatlantic cable was laid between Newfoundland and Ireland. So anyone who goes to the UK, I strongly recommend that visit. Go and see the Greenwich Maritime Museum, and they'll see the prototype clocks developed by John Harrison. Down below at the bottom is a Zulu time clock, or at least the face of a Zulu time clock. And again, the British, I mean, it's just phenomenal what these characters, which I am one or was one, get up to, because they invented the cesium fountain clock at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, which, subject to modifications, is now the most accurate clock in the world, 1 second in 186 billion years. So they call that the Zulu time clock, meaning the British, I believe, control the timing of all significant black propaganda events.
Well, let's just
And
talk
that's
about that
pretty
for a
phenomenal.
second, David, because when we look at a clock in 2020, it's not that impressive. But if you were walking around in 18 whatever, having no idea what time it is, except it's approximately the afternoon and there's a sundial in the town square or whatever, now you've got some device that can tell you precisely what time it is. I think we're really taking that technology for granted. And when that timing device can be placed on a boat or become more accurate than somebody else's to coordinate an army or any kind of thing, people really need to give that some thought, to think about how these developments of technology have advanced humankind. And I mean, it takes us back to our timeline, David, because of course, after the JFK assassination, if we want to talk about 9/11, there were even more significant advances in technology. Now we do have certain elements of artificial intelligence, very probably controlling autopilot technologies that could have been utilized for various purposes that we'll get into. Certainly we had many more civilians that had their own cameras, and they weren't necessarily able to broadcast in real time, but they were certainly able to record. And if you were in New York City recording an image of the plane slamming into the tower, you could certainly make your way to a CNN office within 20 or 30 minutes, and your video could go to air within an hour, whereas in 1963, they needed to go to Kodak and process the film and probably couldn't look at it until the next day. So we see the gap narrowing. What do you want to say, David, about 9/11, artificial intelligence, the advance of technology, et cetera?
Let me just dial back to something that underpins many of these precision time events, and that is what is known as dead pool betting, because the British have a long tradition of putting money through certain gambling clubs on the time of the death of a high-value target or the body count of an assassination. Sorry, the body count of a mass casualty event. So it's absolutely critical to understand that precision timing gives you a head start in almost any activity, whether it's military or trading on the stock exchange. For example, on 911, there would have been many, it says there's a problem in the network.
I've still got you.
You?
No, still here.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm back. If you can do what's called front running, let's say there's a big sell order or a big buy order on aircraft that are flying on 911, if you can measure the time to get a order or a sell or buy order into your broker, right, in nanoseconds, you can jump in ahead of a major buy or sell order that you know is coming in behind you, and you just cream off a little percentage, not too much so it's picked up, that can enrich insiders, right? So it's quite important now to introduce perhaps this term, the CAI private equity group, because what they were able to do, and there's 50 special investors led from a military point of view by General Alexander Haig on 911, what they would be able to do as a private equity group, if they had access to the precision timing technology that would allow you to take a plane off its regular en route airway and flying it into target, they could actually place bets or handle bets on the time of death of the people inside the plane, which I believe is what happened. So real-time interactive wagering on event outcome, as you got there, isn't it interesting that the inventor is Howard Lutnick, who was the chief executive officer of Cantor Fitzgerald at the top of the North Tower, who was out of the office on 911 allegedly taking his son to school, while his brother, and this comes back to maybe the propaganda of World War II, his brother and 657 of his colleagues were working in Cantor Fitzgerald, and they would all fry, right? So this guy flourishes, and he has a patent that would have given him an inside track on placing money, and a great deal of money, on, I don't know, the time of the attack or the body count.
Interesting to note that he was also Jeffrey Epstein's neighbor. Maybe they knew each other, maybe they didn't, but Jeffrey Epstein had all this computer hardware on his jet that James Patterson said was a trading floor, But Charles Ortel says there's no records of Jeffrey Epstein ever doing any trades.
And here it's worthwhile, I think, to look at the technology that is required and the extortion that is required to keep witnesses quiet. And here, regrettably, I come back to British Columbia before looking at the 9/11 attack. And I believe I was at the 1981 International Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence at the University of British Columbia in August of 1981. And I look back on the proceedings. I didn't go to all the proceedings or the lectures. I look back on those lectures and I realized what was being prepared, or I claim what was being prepared, was the technical and criminal environment necessary to pull off the attacks of 9/11 and basically, theoretically or potentially, bring America to its knees. And of course, this is pretty scary. But anyway, I look at one of the proceedings. I've actually printed it out to remind me. And let me read you a piece about the presentation at that conference on autopilot, a distributed planner for air fleet control. And that came out of the RAND Corporation. And I'll just read this. Distributed planning requires both architectures for structuring multiple planners and techniques for planning, communication, and cooperation. We describe a family of systems for distributed control of multiple aircraft in which each aircraft plans its own flight path and avoids collision with the other aircraft. Autopilot, the kernel planner used by each aircraft, comprises several processing experts that share a common world model. Now, folks, just think about what that means. That means each of the aircraft is given the responsibility and assumed to have a common world model of what's in its vicinity. That leaves a huge opportunity for a hacker to jump in to that network, which is controlling the planes on 911, and make sure that there are 1, 2, 3, or 4 planes that do not share that common model, right? That is to say, those are the planes that are going to be hijacked and flown into targets. And the conspirators do not want a United States Air Force interceptor to tag the plane and recognize that it's now been taken over by technology. Is that clear?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, David, I wanted to ask, I mean, isn't it true that we can presume if you've got an artificial intelligence autopilot that can avoid collisions, it could also be made to calculate collisions?
You got it. So it can avoid the scrambled United States Air Force jets. And on 911, not one interception took place. Now, here's my understanding from previous conversations with expert pilots and the documentation. What happens normally is if an air traffic controller sees a plane 5 minutes off azimuth or 5 minutes off time through a scheduled waypoint, he or she contacts the flight supervisor, the air traffic supervisor, who then contacts the nearest Air Force base, United States Air Force Base. And the base manager then deploys a plane, a fighter jet, to tag the offending transport system, right? And probably within 5 or 10 minutes, the American Air Force is practiced at getting to an offending or errant flight path within a few minutes of being told about it, because there are flight bases scattered around the United States. However, what happens if a malicious party, through this company in BC called McDonnell Detweiler and Associates, wins a contract with the United States Air Force for instrument approach procedures where they can take a plane off its regular en route airway and avoid targets and then fly or line up with what is known as final approach procedures to land safely. So ostensibly, McDonnell Detweiler, and I believe this is 20 years after that conference I attended at UBC, had developed the technology where it could trick the United States Air Force into standing down on 911, right? Or having captured the plane electronically, avoid the interceptors, or send the interceptors through artificial reality messaging into the wrong direction, like over the Atlantic, and away from the target in Washington and New York. Over to you.
David, there's been some controversy here in our chat about the possibility of that Telstar satellite being involved in remote broadcasts. Spanman is telling us that he was alive and he remembers it, and that there were no remote video broadcasts in 1963, just reporters calling in by telephone. But I want to make sure that's correct, because although I agree that the actual shooting of JFK was not broadcast live, we've seen some clips since then that do appear to at least present the possibility that they might have been. And this is just a Wikipedia entry for remote broadcast. In broadcast engineering, a remote broadcast, usually just called a remote or a live remote, is broadcasting done from a location away from the television studio. So that would be the basement of the police station, the lobby of the police station, outside the hospital. The first live television broadcast was, I had it here a second ago. First live remote broadcast in the nation was the Canadian Broadcasting Company in 1938. This would be radio, but I had it here a second ago. It said something about the 1955. Let's see if we can find that. I do think on June 11th, 1955, NBC provided the first live remote broadcast from Niagara Falls in New York. But was it TV or radio?
Well, if you look up Telstar, I believe the first transmissions by Telstar were in 1962. And what they say is that the electronics got fried because it ran through the radiation belt, the Van Allen belt. However, we don't know that it got fried. And certainly it came back intermittently. So all I'm saying is that Telstar was available for live satellite transmissions of events. And I believe there is a broadcast by JFK, obviously before he was assassinated, talking about this kind of technology via Telstar to Europe and the BBC. So it would have been technically possible to get a camera, a television camera, pointing at JFK or the Dealey Plaza scene, and capture the exact time when JFK, the back of his head got blown off by a bullet from the front. But yeah, there we are.
Well, but this is very interesting, David, because if the thing is in space, why does it hit the Van Allen belt? In 1962, in July, the Telstar beams the first live television show between Europe and the United States. That's the first live television show. So it seems like they would have tested it before then, but quite clearly technology existed in 1963 that could have done this.
Well, of course. And so this, I believe, is a classic example of artificial reality messaging. They don't want us to believe or understand that there was a possibility for a live television broadcast of the assassination of JFK. More to the point is that they could actually have transmitted the sound of the bullets going off, and they could have had a pretty precise indication of the time that JFK died, right? But I don't want to spend too much time on that, because the point is the British with the Americans have been working hand in hand on the development of technology that allows you to generate artificial reality messages in real time and get in front of the evidence coming from the crime scene that might tell you your first artificial reality message is intended to decoy you into believing, for example, that Osama bin Laden or Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy, when in fact there's every likelihood it was a conspiracy, a coordinated conspiracy, I believe, coordinated out of Canada. But perhaps I digress. Well, there it is. So let's move on to 9/11, right? And the collage, because, and this is fascinating, I think this might pique the interests of our listeners. Back in World War II, the alliance between RCA, Radio Corporation of America, and the BBC resulted in very sophisticated black propaganda being transmitted in real time into the Germany heartland to demoralize the Germans, right? And I'm saying, subject to a name change, because RCAGB 1929 in 1988, through a management buyout and initial public offering arranged by N.M. Rothschild and Sons, changed its name from RCAGB 1929 to Serco. Serco is the world's largest non-state air traffic controller. So perhaps Americans do not understand the significance that on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11 was a meeting of Serco shareholders. Previously, they would have been called RCA shareholders. Well, isn't that interesting that it's quite possible the black propaganda being generated through a partnership between RCA and the BBC in World War II corresponds to the black propaganda being generated by Serco and the BBC on 9/11. So what, as you know, I'm fascinated by is why weren't the shareholders' representatives of Serco on the 47th floor hauled into court by the FBI and say, what did you see? Why were you there? What were you doing? Right? I believe they were running the black propaganda from the 47th floor, 40 floors below the point of impact, where I think their logic would be no one will suspect us of black propaganda if we were so close to the point of impact, because we could have been killed. However, if you're very precise, you can take a building with 200,000 tons of structural steel in it, hit it with a 110-ton plane with a bit of gas inside it, right? It'll burn black smoke, but it will not kill anyone 40 floors below.
Right.
So they can evacuate the building, and therefore, and you have this classical artificial reality messages. We were there. We all escaped, all right? But no one will suspect us, I believe. That was the hope. It's too late now because I do suspect them, all right, of actually participating in the artificial reality messaging subsequent to the attack, which sent Americans in the wrong direction, including the hunt for bin Laden, right? Which is a movie on the hunt for bin Laden, right? Which I believe the producers got the Emmy Award, didn't they?
I think they may have. Let's look that up. It seems like this computer has decided to stop working, David. I'm sort of struggling. It's interesting. We're having a number of technical setbacks here. That's disappointing. I had it all set up. Sorry, David, hang on just one quick second. I had that all set with all of our stuff here, and it's just totally frozen. Having some interesting problems over here today.
Well, I would expect it because I think they don't want the message to get out.
I can't say for sure that these problems are caused by outside interference, but it is interesting when they occur. My sound processing computer totally failed right after the Alex Jones show yesterday. I spent all night rebuilding the thing, and it's not this one that just failed again.
Image, I don't see it anymore.
I've had to restart the computer. We'll be back on with that in just a moment. And David, 25 minutes from now, we'll be proceeding with our sponsor exclusive segment on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI, and subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. We're going to continue our in-depth discussion of all the things that we are talking about right now. We're just about ready to bring this computer back here if it cooperates. There we go. Right. Sorry, please carry on, David.
Yeah, now I'd like to help the listeners by going back to 1969, where I believe there were signals being sent for those people tuned to listen that warned Americans of what was to come. So 1969, Bill Clinton has been expelled from Oxford University under allegations of rape and drug dealing. And so he goes to Moscow. Well, I mean, why don't people ask him why he went to Moscow? I no doubt he's being Bill, he's got an answer at the ready.
But it's very similar to what Lee Harvey Oswald did, isn't it?
Yes. Well, he spent some time in Russia. McDonald Detweiler is founded by John McDonald, an alumnus of the University of British Columbia. And McDonald Detweiler and Associates would go on in the 60s and 70s to develop a technology it called Mobile Data International to track police and suspects in cars through the area around the Lower Mainland and ultimately across British Columbia, across Canada, and into the United States, particularly because McDonald Detweiler, under John McDonald, whom I met in 1995, sold McDonald Detweiler International's MDI, that's Mobile Data International, to Motorola in Chicago. And Motorola in Chicago appears to have equipped the New York Fire Department with radios that were either jammed or negligently failed to act in a proper way on 911, because after the South Tower was demolished, right, the firefighters in the North Tower did not get the signal to evacuate. So they all died. 343 firefighters died on 911 in a massive mass casualty attack because, in my belief, they were ambushed through sabotage of the Motorola radios. Now, Americans should be paying attention to the services that their government gets from various intelligence agencies, because most Americans do not know, it would appear, that the Nortel Entrust public key infrastructure, fiber optics, and wireless and data networks had been outsourced to the Chinese conglomerate Huawei, right, starting during the 1990s. 3 of the directors of Nortel with the CAI private equity group appear to have betrayed their country and betrayed their company by transferring Nortel technologies to Huawei. And I believe that by 911, Huawei controlled the fiber optic and data and wireless links in the World Trade Center. So Huawei would have been in a position to launch a man-in-the-middle attack after the impact of the planes, catch all those firefighters, and destroy the Twin Towers in, I think, what was a general attempt to overthrow the government of the United States that nearly succeeded. So, yeah, good. Thank you for putting up that network picture. So this is the Federal Bridge Certification Authority. And this is where I believe, and you can see Entrust is one of the entities on that federal bridge. And I think Entrust was spun off by Nortel in around the 1993-94 period. And McDonald Detweiler got the contract to train countries and institutions and corporations in the use of Entrust public key infrastructure. And unwittingly, I think, they allowed a back door to be opened by a hacker. Now, whether that hacker, and you know who I'm talking about, is ethical or otherwise, the great problem for people employing hackers to test for vulnerabilities is, are the hackers any good? Not necessarily on the same team, but if, for example, a hacker using Entrust breaks in to the public key infrastructure network used by Boeing to fly planes on 911, that would leave Boeing vulnerable to a hack where its planes could be taken over electronically and flown through these autopilot networks set up by McDonald Detweiler, such that the planes that were hijacked electronically made sure that they were never approached by a United States Air Force interceptor, where the United States Air Force interceptors were sent in the wrong direction, leaving a path. Go ahead.
So you're saying that the artificial intelligence that the Rand Corporation was developing in 1981 very likely could have been used to do this?
Was implemented by McDonald Detweiler, whose founder, John McDonald, is an alumnus of the University of British Columbia, which hosted the 1981 conference that included, as part of its proceedings, this autopilot technology. And I was at that conference, right? And what I was very concerned about, I never had any idea that it would translate into the 911 attack. But what I was concerned about was these very ivory tower isolated computer scientists believing that in any significant sense, they could represent human experts, right? So I wrote a paper, an analysis of expert thinking, and at Schlumberger Doll Research Center, where I had been appointed the director of artificial intelligence, or the coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience, I started developing with a guy called Luke Steels, brilliant man, a system that would ground truth the theories of interpretation in the oil field. But exactly that same technology applies today for ground truthing, crime scene investigations, or interpretations. That's it. So that was published in 1983, but I'd attended the conference in 1981 in the same year that I actually wrote the paper.
Huh.
And this is critical.
Oh, you mean it was published in 83, but you wrote it in 81.
It was published. I wrote it in 81. And they sent me to this conference in British Columbia. Subsequently, I find that British Columbia is the most corrupt jurisdiction in the world, in my experience. Now, why? People will say, why? Well, I'll say, well, you have to go back to 1863 in British Columbia, when the first mission for Aboriginal children was opened, St. Mary's Mission, St. Mary's Residential School up in Mission. Now, the whole story of the residential school system in Canada and BC in particular is beyond horrendous, but people should understand it laid the framework, I think, for an institutional approach to pedophile entrapment and extortion, of which British Columbia became a principal practitioner at the deepest level. It's pretty horrible to think about it. But those children were taken from their families, right? They were forced into these residential schools. I'm quite sure that there were some nuns and priests that were very honorable and trying to do the best they can, right? But a significant number were actually abusing these children physically and sexually. And of course, that creates a framework for the kind of culture, if that's the right word, for what you and I saw in the downtown east side in Vancouver, which is a society that is beyond poor. It's sleeping out on the pavement. It's shooting up in public. There's basically a catastrophic area of the community from which I believe if you have the money, you could recruit just about anyone. So we talked, of course, about the raid on Starnet, where police from the United States, CIA, FBI, US Customs, right, and IRS actually raided this place in Vancouver and confiscated all of the evidence of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming. And this was in 1999. And I think that's the control over the public and the prison population that would allow the conspirators of 9/11 to ensure that the witnesses stayed silent.
This is quite an interesting article, David. It's talking about the adults who were children who suffered abuse at the school are now, exposing it and going back there and stuff. It's hard to believe this sort of thing went on, and it's not that long ago, just looking at how old these people are. But David, time is really flying. We're almost through our show here. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Rand Corporation, the guys who were doing this artificial intelligence development back in 1981. I don't really know too much about them. We discovered last night that their headquarters is here in beautiful Santa Monica. I mean, I'm sure I've been by this building. It's Main Street in Santa Monica. The thing that I found quite strange about this, David, I don't know if you have observed this, but their building, it's shaped like an eyeball, very much like the Eye of Horus or something like that. And it's even got a pupil right in there in the center. And there's a checkerboard on the pupil of the eye. I mean, they're the ones who set up their building and decorated it like this, not me. Perhaps it's an accident, but this checkerboard is symbolic to a lot of people. 1776, Main Street, Santa Monica. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting, but because we don't have a lot of time, if I may, I just want to return to this notion of artificial reality messaging. right? Because I think this is critical, was this, you lay down a perception in the public's mind before the evidence and the news reaches them, and then everything subsequent to that is dismissed as a conspiracy theory. And the British Broadcasting Corporation has perfected that using the technology provided by, for example, RCA and Serco. So I think, what's critically important is, if we go back to the 9/11 attack, is that by planting this artificial reality messaging in the minds of the public, you get the public to believe in a fake view or fake history, right? And it's extremely difficult to extract it. Now, let me just give one of the patents that is in my patent template. Just to remind the audience, I call it, I give it the words strategic lawsuit against public participation, a system and method for creating content such as artificial reality messages at an event, particularly among members on a social network, in enhancing and expanding their experience, sharing it with spectators and friends, and exchanging virtual goods, money, bets, applause, other feedback, and donations, right? Now, this is an incredibly powerful, and for me, a sinister patent, because what it would allow you to do is get onto a social network, inject artificial reality messages, right? Relating, for example, to the spread of the pandemic or the Osama bin Laden theory of the attack on 9/11, and then reward people, let's say through the Internet Movie Database, which basically has a
How
complete
about giving them
profile.
an Emmy? You're going to get
I
applause
was
for an Emmy.
coming to that. So let's look at some of the Emmys that appear to be related to a conspiracy, let's say conceived at UBC in 1980 and delivered through the BBC studios, of actually adjusting who gets the Emmy and who doesn't get the Emmy. I don't think you've been proposed for an Emmy recently. I mean, tell me if you have, and I certainly haven't, right? But
No.
certain people have been awarded Emmys. One of them is Rachel Maddow, right? Rachel Maddow is a Rhodes Scholar from 1995, and she has a show relating to what essentially is a focus critique of Donald Trump. The Manhunt, a film or movie about the hunt for bin Laden. The producers of that got an Emmy. Another one has been, I think it's Judy Foster is her name. She's the star of Killing Eve, which is a weird movie about an ex-MI6 agent.
It's like a series, isn't it?
Well, yes, run through BBC television studios, very successful in the United States. And what that conveys, I've watched some of the trailers, is that it's quite plausible that an intelligence agent should become obsessed with a psychopathic assassin, both, I don't know, the implication is sexually, and they go around in the most horrendous slasher movies, etc. But that is now apparently selling extremely well in the United States. And I'm saying this is a classic example of propaganda being inserted through entertainment media, as described or suggested by Elmer Davis, who was head of the Information War Office during World War II and was the boss of de Blasio's mother.
Right. And right. David, what's the correlation between the War Information Office and the Combined Communications Board?
They're using the same technology in World War II and today, because if you go back to the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, down at the bottom right at about 7 o'clock, the schematic image, you'll see MOD, UK MOD, CCEB route. Now, what that means to Americans or people or entities on the Federal Bridge is the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense controls the entire network because it has access to the route authority. Yeah, if you zoom in there, right, and just over to the right of that, you will see Entrust. So what I believe, Entrust was spun off from Nortel. It provided the public key infrastructure interface into the Federal Bridge through technology developed by Serco at the National Physical Laboratory called Trump. The initial implementation of Trump was to hook up Israel Aircraft Industries, Lloyd's Register, and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. But now Trump, I believe, allows you to set up a virtual private network and spread, for example, the COVID-19 virus or the perception of the COVID virus. Now,
Well, that's what they're doing now, David. They're saying it's Trump's fault. He caused COVID-19, according to Kamala Harris and Andrew Cuomo. For people who haven't seen it before, when you're talking about Trump, David, you don't mean the president. You're talking about this trial, usability, maturity process thing from Serco, where they've joined up these unlikely bedfellows, the Inland Revenue Service, Israeli Aircraft Industries, and Lloyd's Register, to create this dashboard interface type thing.
Now, let me just say, and then we come to the IJCAI conference, where one of the topics of discussion in, I think, the 2018 was payoff control in the iterated prisoner's dilemma. Now, that sounds a little confusing, but it's absolutely vital for people to understand that Bill Clinton, with his 3 strikes law, ably implemented by Kamala Harris, who's the vice president, the running mate of Joe Biden, they introduced and perfected, I believe, the way of manipulating the prison population through the 3 strikes rule. And here's the prisoner's dilemma. Someone like George Floyd could have been told, well, we're going to infect you and vaccinate you against COVID-19, and then you're going to go out and make some pornographic movies and infect people. Well, it turns out, apparently, that George Floyd had been infected by COVID-19. How he got it, I have no idea. It is alleged that he was into pornographic movies, but he'd been arrested 6 times for various offenses. The last one, he had held a gun to a pregnant black woman's belly, and that's a violent felony. Now, under the Bill Clinton regime and the Kamala Harris regime, of course, they have tremendous opportunities to manipulate prisoners by saying, well, we'll put you in jail for life, or we'll infect you with COVID-19 and you'll go out and infect people. Or they don't even have to be told. Basically, they're given a choice. Prison for life, or you go out and become an agent who will do anything to avoid being put back into prison, including, I don't know, going and murdering little John Benet Ramsey. So the Clintons, going back to the 1969 expulsion from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholarship, where he studied, his journey to Moscow, he comes back to Yale, meets his wife, studies, qualifies in law at JD Yale University. Then he slides into the governorship in Arkansas, where he and his wife appear to sponsor the prison blood program. And the prison blood program collected blood from the Arkansas prison system, shipped it up to Canada through a broker in Montreal.
David, we're way off our timeline here. This is not what we're... We have just moments left, but what we wanted to get to is, as we've moved across this timeline, there is a commonality and there's also something new happening. These all rely on utilizing technology and, as Serco has told us, borrowing the network. In the case of the Aspididra, the launching of a bomber fleet caused the German radio network to shut down so that the British could hijack it by overpowering it through analog means. I think we still need to do some more research in terms of how a broadcast network was hijacked in 1963 for this artificial reality messaging. We have discussed the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, which was quite a clever analog way to hijack the network. You basically control the people that are doing the talking and the editorial and all that. So that's certainly a high degree of probability that that was done. In terms of 9/11, we've spoken in great depth how the Federal Bridge could have been used, and we're dealing now much closer with technology. But The final stage, really, of our timeline here that we're showing is this image of Dr. Hannah Fry holding her mobile phone as she does in advertisements for the BBC program Contagion, where she is utilizing software and artificial intelligence algorithms to simulate the spread of a pandemic through her mobile phone, which incidentally, David, carries the functions, essentially, of all of these things. In the 1940s, a British or German citizen would not have been able to easily broadcast to the type of network that a German radio network could. Certainly in the 1960s, you couldn't do that either. Even in 2001, individuals could not do that. But in 2020, holding a phone exactly like the one Dr. Hannah Fry is holding here, exactly like the one a 16-year-old girl used to record the murder of George Floyd, an individual could broadcast to millions of people. And so what's happened is this power that was once reserved for military, governments, and incredible amounts of money and infrastructure has now essentially been placed into the hand of every single person. And David, we're just about out of time, but we're going to continue to explore this phenomenon and other things pertaining to 9/11 and world events being transformed from fake news into fake history when we continue in just under 5 minutes on patreon.com/reversecsi storyboards, subscribestar.com/reversecsi, and subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, I'll see you in 3 minutes.
Thank you, Jason.
See everybody there. Thanks for watching.